Hello, Biology 1620. Today we're going to talk about the origin of the eukaryotes. This is one of the biggest and most fascinating of mysteries in all of biology, so I'm really excited to tell you about it. The fundamental concept for today is that domain eukarya, the eukaryotes, includes several major superkingdoms that we'll talk about, and that the story of the origin of the eukarya is very much a story of symbiosis. That'll be the common theme for this lecture. So we've been building up this timeline of the history of life on Earth, and we're to the point where about 2 billion years ago we have cyanobacteria making oxygen. We now have aerobic metabolisms, taking advantage of all that oxygen. And we're building up to the Cambrian explosion where we have the huge diversification of the animals that we see today. So we've got this big gap still, and in this gap we know that the eukaryotes must have evolved at some point. And I'll tell you why we know that there were not eukaryotes as we know them before the Great Oxygenation Event. We know that the eukaryotes that we know today must have come after there was oxygen, and I will tell you why. So first, a quick review of what eukaryotes are. Here's a standard depiction of what a eukaryotic cell looks like. And basically, it's got a lot of stuff in it. Right, so there's a nucleus, that's the key feature of eukaryotes, and they also have a lot of other membrane-enclosed organelles, which is a word that just means structures inside the cell, like the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria and the Golgi apparatus and various vesicles and the cytoskeleton, which is the machinery that moves stuff around the cell. You get all this stuff, and we have a whole course, cell biology, where you get to learn about all this stuff. It's really cool, it's fascinating. And where did it come from? Because bacteria and archaea do not look like this. They have their own fascinating cell biology. Their cells are not empty. They have different things in them, and very different things than what you see in eukaryotes. So where did all this stuff come from? That's the question for today. I've shown this figure before, indicating that these words prokaryote and eukaryote at one time implied that the eukaryotes must have evolved from the prokaryotes. The word prokaryote kind of implies that it came first and then the eukaryotes came later. And we've talked about how the word prokaryote has advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is that it's not monophyletic because it includes both archaea and bacteria, and that is not a monophyletic group because the archaea and eukarya, we think, have a more recent common ancestor than either does with bacteria. But it is useful to talk about these big cell biology differences, and mostly the unique properties of the eukaryotic cell. And we do think that the eukaryotes came later. The eukaryotes were almost certainly not the first types of cells on Earth. There were other kinds of cells, and then the eukaryotes came later. All right, so how did this happen? So the answer, we'll just come right out and say it, and then we'll explain a little bit more how we know the answer and what all of the implications are. But basically the answer is symbiosis. So one of the key features, in addition to the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell, are the mitochondria. These mitochondria were at one point engulfed by a eukaryotic ancestor into the cell, and by a process called endosymbiosis. Okay? And a very important clue to how we know this is that the mitochondria have their own genomes. Their genomes have genes, and we can sequence those genes. This is also true of the chloroplast. The chloroplast also has its own genome, it has its own genes, and we can sequence those genes, and these gene sequences of the mitochondrial and chloroplast genomes tell us that they came from bacteria. The mitochondria and the chloroplast are enslaved bacteria, bacteria that entered into a symbiotic relationship with a eukaryotic ancestor, and they are now permanent organelles, permanent endosymbionts of the eukaryotic cell. So before we jump into the biology of this, I want to acknowledge that a very early proponent and someone who did a lot of work on these ideas of the endosymbiotic origin of the mitochondria and chloroplasts is Lynn Margulis. When she first started promoting this idea that the eukaryotic cell is fundamentally a endosymbiotic, it's a symbiotic being, she was heavily criticized. which often happens in science. New radical ideas, and this is a truly radical idea, are almost always roundly criticized as being radical and crazy. And it took a lot of work and a lot of evidence to convince all of the old fogies that this was real, that this is really how the eukaryotic cell evolved. And nowadays her name, this is a quote from someone, that her name is now synonymous with symbiosis, just like Charles Darwin's name is synonymous with evolution. So she deserves a lot of the credit for this idea that mitochondria are endosymbiotic bacteria. So these 3 important points, so you know that these are important for you to know. But mitochondria, they evolved from bacteria. They have genes, including the 16S ribosomal RNA gene, which is this gene that we have used to make the tree of life. Their 16S genes are on the tree of life right next to bacteria. So it's very clear direct evidence. Before we could sequence these genes, the evidence was a little more indirect. Lynn Margulis did not have the advantage of having these gene sequences when she was arguing for her theories. She was relying on basically microscope observations and some chemical information about the structure of these mitochondria. But now it's very obvious. You sequence the genes inside these mitochondria. And first of all, it's already a pretty big clue that they have their own DNA, right? You sequence their DNA and they look exactly like bacteria. All eukaryotes have mitochondria. All of the eukaryotes that we will talk about, all of the species in domain eukarya today have mitochondria. And there are only a few weirdos that are the exceptions to prove this rule. And the reason why the exceptions prove the rule is that all of the exceptions recently evolved from ancestors that did have mitochondria. So the few eukaryotes that we know of that do not have mitochondria, they're very recent evolutionary innovations where they have lost their mitochondria for weird, interesting reasons. Okay, so all of so this means that the common ancestor of all eukaryotes must have had mitochondria. Then finally, mitochondria are aerobic. They use oxygen and they make ATP. So the oxygen that we breathe in our own cells, that oxygen is respired not so much directly by our own cells exactly, but the oxygen that is respired in our cells is specifically respired by the mitochondria. So these endosymbiotic bacteria are the ones that are actually breathing the oxygen for us. We no longer think of them as being apart from us, right? Mitochondria are obviously part of our cells, but it's interesting to think about how the aerobic metabolism of eukaryotes is a feature of this bacterial metabolism. So here I want to prove to you my earlier claim that the mitochondria are bacteria. So here is a phylogenetic tree of one specific group of bacteria, specifically class alpha proteobacteria, which is within phylum Proteobacteria, and subclass within alpha proteobacteria Rickettsia, which is being shown here. And then within the subclass Rickettsia, there are a few different groups within that group, right? So this is a very specific group of bacteria. And one lineage within the specific group of bacteria is the protomitochondrial lineage. So if you sequence the 16S gene of the mitochondria, and it doesn't matter which mitochondria you sequence, all mitochondria of all eukaryotes would be placed in this one branch within this bacterial family. Right, so all of the mitochondria of all of the eukaryotes, their 16S ribosomal RNA genes would fit right here in this group of bacteria. So I think that's a pretty cool demonstration of the power of phylogeny to, if not solve, provide a really, really important clue to how the eukaryotes evolved. That is, their mitochondria came from this one specific group of bacteria. So naturally, scientists have been interested in this one specific group of bacteria because it is the origin of the mitochondria, and it has been studied for that reason. So just a few words about some of the relatives of our mitochondrial ancestors, one of which is our weird life of the day for today. There's one species called the Midichlorian mitochondria. They are bacteria that are pathogens. They are parasites infecting the mitochondria of the ticks that cause Lyme disease. Right? So Lyme disease is a nasty disease that you can get when a tick bites you. And it just so happens that the mitochondria of the cells in those ticks are susceptible to an infection by these bacteria that were called mitochondria because they actually infect the mitochondria. And in this official research paper published in the official Journal of Bacterial Taxonomy, when you name a new species of bacteria, you have to include at least a few words about why you chose that name. And they chose the genus name Midichloriae, inspired by Star Wars. And note that George Lucas has stated that his idea of midichlorians in the Star Wars universe is based on the endosymbiotic theory of mitochondria and chloroplasts. So they thought it was a fitting tribute to that idea. Anyway, thought that was a fun thing to mention. Perhaps more importantly, another cousin of our mitochondrial ancestor is this group called Pelagibacter. Pelagibacter is one of the smallest bacteria in the world. It's very, very tiny. And it's also one of the most abundant bacteria in the whole world because they're one of the most abundant aerobic heterotrophic bacteria in the ocean. So last time we talked about the microbial loop and how half of the microbial loop are aerobic heterotrophic bacteria respiring organic matter that was made by the phytoplankton back into CO2, completing the cycle. And these Pelagibacter are one of the most important bacteria that are doing that step of the microbial loop. Okay, so it's pretty interesting that our mitochondria are related to very small, mitochondria are small, aerobic, mitochondria are doing aerobic metabolism for us, and they're extremely abundant in the ocean. So I think that's an interesting observation. That's the end of part 1. See you in part 2.